It was the local constable who first found the girl, soaked barefoot and caked in peat, mumbling in Irish to someone no one else could see. The town of Glenish, nestled in the western valleys of County Mayo, is the sort of place that feels immune to time. In 1947, the war had just ended, but Glenish hadn't noticed much change. A small, mist-laced village surrounded by bogland and crumbling stone cottages, its people clung to tradition like a raft in deep water. Gaelic was still spoken in the home. Catholic Mass was still held in candlelit chapels with damp stone walls, and neighbors still whispered stories by the hearth when the wind howled too long at night. It's here, in this half-forgotten village at the edge of Lough Clune, that the McGrath twins, Orla and Aisling, were born under a blood moon in February of 1939. They were delivered by midwife Brud Sheehan, who would later claim that the wind outside the cottage stopped entirely during the birth, as if something were listening. Brud would never speak of that night again. From the very beginning, the girls were unusual, identical in every visible way, hair the color of wet ash, eyes pale as glass. They shared not only a face but a private language. It wasn't Gaelic nor English. It sounded like something older, rougher. Even their mother, Noreen McGrath, couldn't understand it. They'd speak to each other like crows cackling in the trees. She once told the priest. But they always knew what the other meant. Locals started to notice strange behavior around the girls as they aged. They rarely played with the other children and never attended school. Noreen, their mother, claimed they were too sensitive for public life, prone to seizures and sudden silences. They would stare at empty corners for minutes at a time, nodding slowly, as if responding to something invisible. Their father, Saran McGrath, a quiet, stoic man who worked in the bog fields, simply told those who asked that his daughters were blessed by silence. But in small towns like Glenish, people watch, and people talk. Father Thomas Tierney, the parish priest for nearly 2 decades, made several visits to the McGrath cottage after villagers raised concern. He later wrote in his diary, a brittle leather-bound ledger found years later in the sacristy attic, "The girls are strange. One speaks aloud, the other whispers, but I could never tell which one was doing the whispering." The twins were 8 years old when something shifted. It began with the crows. In late autumn of 1947, villagers reported an unusual number of black birds gathering around the McGrath property. Dozens at first, then hundreds. They perched on the roof, the trees, the fence posts. They watched the windows. Local farmer Denal Keane claimed he saw one of the girls. He didn't know which, standing barefoot in the rain, arms outstretched as the birds swirled silently above her, like she was drawing them down from the sky. He told a traveling constable weeks later, and they were listening. By November, something worse happened. The older McGrath boy, Eamon, age 12, vanished without explanation. One morning, he was feeding the goats. By evening, he was gone. No trace, no blood, no signs of struggle, just his boots by the gate and a strange, spiral-shaped symbol drawn in the dirt beside them. The family didn't report him missing for 3 days. When authorities were finally notified, a limited search was conducted across the fields and bogs near Lough Clune. The efforts turned up nothing. But several searchers, most notably Sergeant Declan Joyce, reported hearing faint singing from beneath the peat, like a lullaby sung through water. One volunteer even claimed he saw a small, pale hand beneath the bog surface. When they dug at the spot, they found nothing but brackish mud and shards of bone too old to date. Tensions grew. The McGraths became pariahs. Villagers stopped walking near their home. Noreen rarely left. Ciaran grew gaunt and withdrawn. But it was the twins who drew the most attention. People swore they were becoming more identical by the day, down to their posture, their inflection, the rhythm of their footsteps. If one fell ill, so did the other. If one cried, the other wiped her own cheeks. And then, just before Christmas of that year, one of them disappeared. It was a bitter night. Snow covered the bog fields and the frost clung to the blackthorn hedges like brittle lace. Noreen McGrath came stumbling into town at dawn, barefoot and raving. She was carrying one of the twins, Orla or Aisling, wrapped in an old wool coat. The child was freezing, trembling violently, her eyes wide open and fixed on the ceiling. Noreen kept screaming that the other one's still speaking, and that they took her in place of the boy. Authorities took the girl to St. Brigid's Infirmary in Westport, where she was treated for hypothermia and shock. She never spoke a word to the doctors. But at night, she whispered constantly to the empty space beside her bed. An orderly named Eileen Molloy later testified in an internal report she'd lie there, eyes wide, lips moving, but only when the lights were off. I leaned in once, just once, and I swear I heard 2 voices. One was hers, the other it was deeper, like a grown man pretending to be a child. Thus, back in Glenish, the search for the missing twin was brief and fruitless. No evidence of abduction, no footprints leading away from the cottage. The snow was undisturbed. It was as if she'd vanished in place with the wind. There were, however, drawings. Under the missing girl's bed, tucked into the wall slats, authorities found dozens of torn notebook pages filled with crude pencil sketches. Many showed the twins standing side by side, but in some, one of them was submerged in a black pool, while the other looked on from the shore. One drawing depicted a mass of outstretched hands beneath the ground, reaching upward. In the center of that one, the twins were holding hands, one smiling, the other weeping. The surviving girl, after being released from hospital weeks later, was placed in the care of the church. Her parents, both unfit by state standards, were moved to a work farm in County Mayo. It's there, quietly and without ceremony, that Orla McGrath took his own life. A note was found in his coat pocket, though its writing had been smeared by the rain. Only one phrase could be made out: they never spoke the same language. In the church-run orphanage outside Castlebar, the girl remained eerily still for months. She ate, slept, and bathed without resistance, but never responded to questions or engaged with other children. Nuns grew concerned over her nightly whisperings, which often escalated to shrill laughter or violent sobbing. She claimed to be speaking to her sister, and that her sister was beneath the house now. Sister Agnes O'Day, who kept notes on the girl's behavior, wrote in an archived record dated April 3, 1948, "We no longer believe the child is playing. She insists her twin is still present, and she converses with her as if she were seated beside her. When reprimanded, she simply says, she gets angry when I don't talk to her." For that spring, the building's cellar was sealed shut after 2 staff members claimed to hear knocking from behind the stone walls. Still, no psychological diagnosis ever fully explained the girl's behavior, and as the years passed, the story faded. Glenish retreated into silence. The bogs swallowed their secrets, and no more was heard from the McGraths until 1972. That year, a team of geology students from Trinity College Dublin conducted a peat core sampling near Glenish for an academic project. While extracting deep sediment layers from a preserved bog near Lough Clune, one student reported pulling up fragments of what appeared to be fabric, followed by a small human femur. The sample was rushed to a forensic lab in Dublin, where the bone was dated and identified as belonging to a child, aged 8-10 female. DNA matched the remaining samples from the hospital's stored tissue records of the McGrath twin. But the body didn't belong to the missing twin. It belonged to the survivor. And so, a question was raised, one that no one could answer: who, then, had been whispering to no one all those years. The discovery should have closed the case. Instead, it reopened wounds that Glenish had spent decades trying to forget. When news of the DNA mismatch reached County Mayo in the autumn of 1972, it spread quietly but swiftly. Not through newspapers or radio, but through whispers, at market stalls and chapels during wakes. Glenish didn't respond with outrage or denial. It responded with a silence so thick that Father O'Connell, the then parish priest, described it as a hush like fog, you could feel it between people. So authorities launched a limited reinvestigation, headed by Detective Liam Hart of the Gardaí's Cold Case Division. Hart was methodical, the book officer with no patience for superstition, but even he admitted early in his investigation that nothing about the McGrath case added up cleanly. Hart's first stop was St. Brigid's Orphanage outside Castlebar, where the surviving twin, still registered under the name Orla McGrath, had remained until the age of 17 before vanishing from official records in 1956. There had been no adoption papers, no death certificate. Just a gap. Sister Agnes O'Day, now retired and in failing health, agreed to an interview with Hart at a hospice in Galway. She spoke slowly, often pausing to find breath, but her memory of the girl remained sharp. She never aged right, Agnes said. Looked 10 when she was 12, then 16 when she was still a little thing. But it wasn't her body that aged strange. It was her eyes. They never softened. See, when Hart asked why the girl left the orphanage, Sister Agnes lowered her voice. She didn't leave. She was given. There were no official adoption records, but among the archives, Hart found a sealed letter dated July 8, 1956, marked with the sigil of a private religious order, the Congregation of the Sacred Mirror. The group was obscure, barely known even within the broader Catholic hierarchy. Founded in 1923 in Switzerland and active primarily in rural Ireland and northern Spain, the order had a reputation for housing children deemed spiritually compromised. No formal accusations had ever been brought against them, but among clergy it was known. If a child was speaking to things that weren't there, the sacred mirror would take them. What happened to Orla, or Aisling? After that point is where the story takes its most disturbing turn. Hart's research led him to an abandoned convent near Tuam, long since reclaimed by moss and time. Locals remembered it as the Hollow House, a place children were warned to avoid. There, in a back room filled with moldering hymnals and rat nests, Hart found a single trunk. Inside were notebooks, hymn sheets, and patient reports. Many were water-damaged and illegible, but several remained intact. One folder, dated 1957-1959, was labeled "This Case They 310 McGrath," whereas contained within were psychological observations from several nuns and one Jesuit visitor. The notes grew increasingly disjointed over time. At first, they tracked standard behavioral metrics, hours of speech, social engagement, reading comprehension. But by the third month, the tone shifted. April 3, 1957, the girl refers to herself in the plural. She insists her sister is present during meals and demands an empty chair be left beside her. May 17, 1957, during night prayers, she began to chant in a non-Gaelic tongue. When confronted, she said, "You're not meant to understand." Who for June 9, 1957, Father Matteo attempted an informal exorcism. The girl laughed throughout. When he held the crucifix to her, she said, "That worked on the others, not on me." One final entry, dated December 12, 1959, was written in a different hand and much shakier script. "She's teaching the others now. We hear 2 voices when she sleeps, sometimes 3. Shortly after that final entry, the convent was closed. No official reason was ever given. Hart believed the girl had either died there or been moved. No records showed a burial, and attempts to contact remaining members of the Sacred Mirror were met with silence or hostility. But then came the call from an archivist at the National Folklore Collection in Dublin. The archivist, Clodagh Reilly, had been compiling oral histories from the west of Ireland, digitizing old wax cylinder recordings and hand-written transcripts collected by teachers in the 1930s and 40s. She'd been cataloging recordings made in Glenish and surrounding parishes when she stumbled upon something unusual. A 1948 transcript from a boy named Tágur Seeknessé, aged 10 at the time, described in startling detail the games played by the McGrath twins. It read, "They take turns drowning," he said. "One goes under the water in the bog hole. The other counts to 50. Then they switch. But they don't breathe different after. They don't shiver. And they always smile like they're still under." Another entry, from a girl named Maeve Goggin, was more chilling still. "They said they weren't really twins. That one of them was made in the bog. That's why her mouth tasted like metal. These weren't fabrications. Children were strange, yes. But when multiple independent sources from the same town began echoing themes that hadn't been publicized or preserved in media, Hart felt something more than folklore was at play. But perhaps the most damning clue came from a local historian named Padraig Flynn. He'd spent years studying Glenish and its pre-Christian roots, particularly its connection to the old burial mounds in the bogland. According to Flynn, Lough Clune had long been avoided by locals not because of drowning dangers, but because of the Singalti, a regional myth of bound ones. The Flynn explained they're not ghosts and they're not spirits. They're echoes, copies. When someone dies in the bog, if the death is violent or ritualized, the land remembers. Sometimes it gives something back that isn't quite the same. He pointed to similar myths from Orkney to Galicia, doubles that replace the drowned, but lack something fundamental. He believed the McGraths, intentionally or not, had been involved in something ancient. A rite, a bargain, or a mistake. Then came the breakthrough. An anonymous letter arrived at Garda headquarters in November 1973. It was written in shaky, childlike script and signed only, Aisling. The letter claimed that the surviving twin had never left, and that she was still in the bog under the breath of the reeds. Accompanying the letter was a photograph, grainy and water, damaged, showing a young woman, maybe late teens, standing at the edge of Lough Clune. Her hair was wild, her dress torn. But the eyes were unmistakable, wide, pale, reflective. Analysis dated the photo to approximately 1955. But there was no record of anyone in Glenish owning a camera at that time. In the final stages of his investigation, Hart returned to Glenish. He walked the perimeter of the McGrath cottage, now collapsed and buried beneath vines. In the soot of the hearth he found something lodged behind the stones, a charred, half-burned diary. Only a few entries remained. They were signed Noreen. She says she's not Aisling anymore. That Orla went beneath and the voice that came back was older. I made her sleep in the root cellar. She sang to something through the floor. The goats don't come near the house. I heard both of them last night, but I only saw one. What Hart wrote in his final report would never be released publicly. But a copy was leaked to journalist Moira Langan in 1974 and forms the basis of everything we know about the last moments of his search. His final line reads, "There was no survivor. Only one girl came back, but she brought something with her. There are certain places in the world where memory lingers, not just in people, but in the soil, the trees, the water. Glenish, many now believe, is one of them." The case of the McGrath twins remained officially unsolved. Detective Hart resigned the following year. His notes were quietly archived, inaccessible without special permission. When asked why he left, he simply told colleagues, I found the answer. I just don't know what question it belonged to. But the story didn't stay buried. Not entirely. In 1985, a new figure entered the story. Dr. Aileen Kerrigan, a cultural anthropologist from Queen's University Belfast, was conducting a doctoral study on post-war trauma in isolated Irish communities. Her fieldwork brought her to Glenish, where she spent the better part of 3 winters interviewing surviving villagers, now elderly and mostly reluctant to speak. At first, they shared the usual recollections, ration lines, hard winters, sheep births. But whenever she mentioned the McGrath family, something in them recoiled. One man, a former altar boy, refused to even say their name. He only muttered, "You never name what the bog takes." Then came a breakthrough. An elderly woman named Maura Finn agreed to be interviewed under condition of anonymity. She had been a midwife in training in 1947, working under Bread Sheehan, the woman who delivered the McGrath twins. According to Maura, there had been complications during the birth, details not recorded in any hospital logs because, in truth, there was no hospital. The twins were born in the cottage, during a windstorm so violent that even the chapel bell rang without touch. Bread had called it a boundary night, when the veil between worlds wore thin. But it wasn't the birth that Maura found strange, it was the moment afterward. There were 3 cries, she told Kerrigan, but only 2 babies. She recalled that one of the infants had stopped breathing shortly after birth. Bread had tried everything, rubbing her chest, mouth-to-mouth prayer. Nothing worked. Noreen, already delirious from the loss of blood, began to sing, a song neither Maura nor Bread recognized. It was in Irish, but the words didn't make sense. Then the child began to breathe again. Kerrigan was skeptical, until she found something buried in church records from that winter, a brief, scribbled note from Father Tierney, written on the back of a homily. "Rebaptized twins today," Sheehan insisted. Odd one would not take the sacrament. Water ran off skin like oil, noted for further prayer. Armed with this, Kerrigan returned to the site of the old McGrath home, now barely a scatter of rocks and weeds. There, she found a group of local teenagers had broken through the root cellar and turned it into a crude hangout. Inside, Kerrigan found scraps of burnt paper, beer bottles, and something else, a half-melted tape recorder. What was left on the tape would never be played on radio, but Kerrigan transcribed what she could before handing the device over to the Garda. There were 2 voices. One was faint, childlike, barely above a whisper. The other was lower, strained, as if echoing up from a well. The faint voice asked questions. "Do you remember the tree? What did Ma'am say when we came out? Why did we change shoes?" The lower voice answered only once, "Luff, because she prayed for me." Not you. Kerrigan's research concluded that what happened in Glenish was not a case of shared delusion, nor simple trauma. She posited a phenomenon she called cultural haunting, a term for when entire communities, especially those steeped in oral traditions, create psychological feedback loops through generations. But the problem with her theory was that new incidents kept occurring. Between 1991 and 1997, 3 children from surrounding counties disappeared near Lough Clune. Each went missing during overcast days. Each left behind only a coat or shoe. One left behind a drawing etched into a school notebook, a spiral of hands surrounding a girl with 2 faces. None of the bodies were recovered. Then in 2003, a father and daughter hiking through Glenish's outer bog fields stumbled upon what they first thought was a wooden statue, buried waist deep in the peat. It turned out to be a preserved child's body, almost perfectly intact, despite over 50 years underground. It was the missing McGrath twin, but there was something wrong. Forensic reports would later confirm that the preservation was unlike any other bog body found in Europe. The eyes were still open, the lungs were filled with water, but it was not bog water. It contained minerals consistent with glacial spring water from Lough Clune. There were no wounds, no trauma, but in the girl's stomach were traces of a plant that no longer grew in Ireland, Has ligusticum scoticum, known as Scotch loveage, a herb historically used in early Celtic rituals to ward or call the old voices. Even more troubling, the body had been placed upright, her hands clasped in front of her chest, almost like she had been heirs offered. No one claimed the remains. No new relatives came forward. The body was quietly reinterred in a private cemetery in Castlebar under a false name, but the photographs leaked, and so did the rumors. In a 2006 interview for an independent documentary, Dr. Kerrigan reflected on her final visit to Glenish. She had returned to say goodbye to Maura Finn, who was dying of cancer. The 2 sat together in the kitchen of Maura's crumbling cottage, the rain thick on the windows. Maura asked her a final question: if a soul is split in 2, and both pieces are raised to believe they're whole, which one gets to rest when they die? Kerrigan never answered. Instead, she left Glenish that night and never returned. In 2009, she was found dead in her Belfast apartment. A stroke, the coroner said, but her last notebook was open on the table. Inside was a final note. "I heard her whisper last night. She was asking for her sister. But I was alone." There are few things more terrifying than uncertainty. But in Glenish, the fear was never about what people didn't know. It was about what they suspected, and could never say aloud. By 2010, the case of the McGrath twins had become something of a closed wound in County Mayo, a story too dark to teach, too too strange to fully disbelieve. The bogs grew over the old paths. The McGrath family home had long since rotted into the earth, and yet there was something in the air around Lough Clune, a heaviness, a stillness, like waiting. But folklore has a way of repeating itself. On August 3, 2011, a nurse named Fiona Walsh, hiking the perimeter of the lake with her 4-year-old son, reported that the boy stopped suddenly, stared at the water, and whispered, "That girl's still under." When asked what girl, the boy replied, "The one who smiles too big. She's holding someone's hand down there." Authorities found no one at the lake that day, no bodies, no evidence. But over the next several weeks, anonymous reports flooded in from hikers, farmers, and 2 field researchers from Galway, reports of a child's voice humming in the reeds, of footprints appearing in the bog where no one had walked, of stones arranged in twin circles on the path leading to the lake's shore. A freelance journalist, Declan Morley, began investigating the old McGrath legend. He re-interviewed retired detective Liam Harday, now in his 70s and living alone in a cottage outside Clifton. Hart refused to go on record, but he left Morley with a single quote scribbled on the inside cover of his original case file. "Sometimes the dead don't return. They wait for the living to come to them." Morley's investigation culminated in a podcast series that never aired. He vanished before releasing the final episode. His car was found outside Glenish, keys still in the ignition. On the passenger seat sat an envelope containing a child's drawing, 2 girls holding hands, one without a face. The Garda did not reopen the case, but a small civil inquiry was launched by a group of independent researchers, clergy, and forensic anthropologists. Among them was Dr. Oif Redmond, a folklorist from University College Cork, who had long argued that rural Irish myths often conceal forgotten histories of abuse, isolation, and institutional trauma. Dr. Redmond's theory diverged from the supernatural. She believed the McGrath case was the tragic culmination of a post-war mental health crisis, compounded by religious extremism and social neglect. The idea of a twin returning from the bog, she wrote in her report, "Fae is a metaphor for dissociation, for the unspeakable being given shape." It's no accident this myth arose around a family already steeped in grief, secrecy, and cultural shame. And yet, not everyone agreed. Father Colm Sweeney, an aging Jesuit who had once corresponded with the Sacred Mirror Order in the 1970s, claimed in an unpublished letter, "There are things older than trauma, older than guilt. Some voices do not speak from memory, they speak from the deep." In 2014, following a Freedom of Information request, several records pertaining to the Sacred Mirror Order were declassified. Among them were travel logs showing that in 1956, a group of clergy from the order had visited Glenish and remained there for 13 days. No activity was logged during that time, but an expense report itemized 4 sets of boots.